Today's video is on a single type of piece of equipment that was sold in the 80s and 90s. The Rabbit Multiplier, wireless VCR extender, Videocaster, etc. An audio-video transmitter that could be used as a wired or wireless type depending on which one you bought and what year. Bit of history. 1984, Rabbit Systems Incorporated was founded for the Rabbit VCR multiplying system wireless transmitter. But the FCC objected, and the FCC approval failed after 9 months and over $1 million spent. Instead of just telling them exactly how they were allowed to do it. Now, you might be wondering how this could work in the old days when people had cabling and antennas all over the place. Let's continue. 1986, Rabbit VCR multiplying system became a wired transmitter, which is kind of a weird statement, but that's actually just as accurate as your VCR to your TV set in the old days. It was released and sold through Archer, Tandy, RadioShack, and many other companies, and allowed sending a VCR videocassette recorder's output to up to 5 television sets in the house within a 120-foot distance along a wire that could be repeated from transmitter to receiver, and then from each of those receivers could act as a repeater to the next one. It also allowed the infrared remote signals from any room to be sent back through the equipment to the VCR if it had a remote input that was universal. You didn't have to buy any additional VCRs. It was cheaper than a VCR. All went through an untwisted, differential, balanced wire pair. Now, you might not know any of these things, but really old TV aerial lead-ins were 2 wires spaced about ½ inch apart, wrapped in a plastic that made them look flat. It was sometimes called a ribbon lead or whatever. And these were designated at 300 ohms impedance. Impedance is different than resistance. What this means is it's a propagation path through 2 wires that are set an exact distance apart, so that no variation in the distance would happen, so that the wires wouldn't create a reflection point where the signal would start ghosting. And you could use this, I mean, you can have any variety you want to. The further apart they are, the different the impedance would be. And if you needed to change them, you could make it 400 ohms by cutting notches in the plastic to make it to where there was air between them instead of the plastic. There's a bunch of equations for this I'm not going to go into, but most of the calculators work, although most of them don't want to work with really tiny numbers when you put in untwisted, balanced, differential wire pairs that are tiny. I went through the trouble of looking this up. But anyway, once that was put out, another company bought the name in 1990. Rabbit Systems Incorporated consumer electronics product naming rights for Rabbit and the video multiplier from Rabbit Systems Incorporated were bought by Gemini. This is the one that actually has the radio transmitter with an antenna. By 1990, the FCC rules concerning a specific frequency range changed to where they could get away with having a radio transmitter. And the FCC rules were you had to buy a license that would apply to all the equipment. It would have to have the FCC labeling on it, which means it legally could be used as essentially a TV transmitter at that frequency. And it had to be below a certain wattage, and it had to tolerate interference and could not cause interference, which means it had to really dance around a dead space band. They sold it as the Videocaster because it was actually broadcasting it. An FCC licensed RF consumer, RF or TV transmitter, and antenna. The antenna length has to be within a certain range. It has physical length and width and a bunch of characteristics. If you extended the wire, you might cause problems. And it was set, now this is the only thing, only one source says what the frequency was, 900 megahertz. This was where you'd had cordless phones and walkie-talkies and narrowband radio comms of any kind you wanted. And later on, the company went out of business, and that's it. Gemini was owned by one person, and the Rabbit Systems things was owned by another one, and there's a whole bunch of hullabaloo about it. The Wikipedia page was for the Rabbit multiplier itself, so we could get some more useful information, was completely cacked. It's gone. There's not even an archive of it anywhere. In fact, it may have never been anything more than a stub or a redirect. Okay, Why is it you don't have to have an FCC license when you're transmitting channel 3 from your video game console to your TV set? Because it's kept within a cable. You see, twisted wire, if you transmit a signal, will send a signal out. Shielded cable mostly doesn't. So if it goes through shielded cable or it immediately goes to an adapter, even if it goes to the twin lead that is sending a signal, the FCC qualifies that as not intentionally sending a signal, and on your best behavior, you're trying not to interfere with any other equipment at that frequency. These days, if you use the 900 megahertz or any frequency that's used by anybody, you're going to get into a lot of hot trouble. No wattage minimum is required for a court case, and it's like thousands of dollars, and it's immediate prison time. They don't even dick around. They just tell you, unplug it and turn it over, or you're going to go to prison. The punishment is absolute, and there's nothing you can do about it. Just the fact that you made noise. They do have designations and rules about incidental or accidental transmission from, let's say, a Model T spark gap distributor cap or something. You have to put a snubber on it, get rid of those signals, but other than that, they're not going to put you in prison. If you refuse to and keep making radio signals, they will consider this intentional transmission of interference. Interference transmission, otherwise known as jamming radio signals, is a federal offense. Okay, so now you understand why they spent close to $1 million not wanting to have thousands of devices offending. There are apparently in existence 2 or 3 dozen 1984 Rabbit Systems multipliers that use the radio transmitter they used. Now, here's the funny thing. We're not allowed to have, by law, radio transmitters that do TV set signals. If it's analog. If it's a digital, no problem, because you can squeeze the bandwidth tighter and have no interference, and suddenly you can buy equipment that does this. But here's the funny part. FCC licensing was not infinite. It was subject to immediate revocation at any time. And of course they publicly posted, if you have one of these pieces of equipment, you can't use it anymore if it transmits. But the wired version that was sold from like 1986 to 1990, and even after that, they still sold the wired version. All it is it's a distribution system within building. It's still using a radio signal. It's using a push-pull cabling thing, and it's done through parallel, not twisted wires. When you twist them, it changes the impedance and actually does better things. It makes it to where it doesn't make as much radiation leave. It doesn't transmit as far. If you used it as an antenna, you'd fail. And it improves the rejection of radio signals, so you get better quality signals on a twisted pair. Now, this is the equivalent, not quite, but almost the equivalent to using a piece of straight telephone cable like you'd wire a house with for telephone lines. Some of you still do that, as a communication hookup. So RadioShack sold, now this thing is, this miniature 2-conductor plastic-coated wire was sold under RadioShack part numbers as a type of a paired 2-conductor hookup wire for the little earphones you get when you hook up the crystal radio sets and stuff. It's still available, but after all, they started selling it with a twist in it because they could just make it out of 2 separate strands, and that was more cheaply done. The type that was paralleled, which was a bane in my existence for working on headphones, because a lot of headphones were made with the same wire. It was all over the place in the United States and other countries for all sorts of low wattage activities. This wire did have a characteristic impedance to it. Now, I tried running the calculations, and I got, depending on how I put the information in, because I can't find anything more than it was 24 gauge and 50 feet long, this would have resulted in the spacing that you can see being estimated would be anywhere from 180 ohms characteristic impedance down to like 50. And if you're not aware of it, 50 ohm impedance and 75 ohm impedance are quite commonly used for technical equipment, so you could kind of get away with using this with anything that has a BNC plug, like an oscilloscope or some high-end radio transmitters, all the way to literally the 75 ohm cable company cables. You take the connector, just hook it up. It will be unbalanced, but it will still do the push-pull thing. The idea with a balanced pair is it ignores a lot of things, but it's subject to being near ground. Okay. This is a lot like trying to get the impedance matching crap fixed on a stage when you're dealing with guitar amps and stuff. It's not fun. But anyway, the point is, the signal transmitted and received may have been just a frequency upscaled, or just a radio transmitter for TV upscaled, or whatever, by octaving or whatever, to 900 megahertz, or it could have been something else through the wire. Now here's the funny thing. If you run it through a wire, it can be ridiculously low power. And because it's impedance matched, if any leakage happens, it's going to be very weak. This wouldn't have violated FCC rules, and that's why they did it. But they spent years trying to make it to where they didn't have to run wires. Now, in this day and age, with privacy concerns, yeah, that's where I'm going. Now, that's the first thing, is that if this thing is still found, if it's the wired version, FCC not going to have a complaint with it. It's going to be using a pseudo-proprietary thing, but it's probably just going to be a TV transmission, because you could buy TV transmitters and just run a different crystal or a different oscillator set, pair parts, whatever, things, and get it working. I'd love to see the wiring for one of these. The more popular one from the other company for Gemini are still available. They still carry an FCC licensing to them from the 1990s that allows them to exist, only because they happen to pick a frequency that it's still okay, I guess, or not. If you buy one, this may be a consumer alert. I wouldn't recommend turning it on. So, now we get to the next thing. I was trying to look up if any stations in the United States or anywhere on the planet were still using analog TV broadcasts. Again, they consume a lot of bandwidth. They don't compress things. All TV broadcasts now compress and use a very narrow band because you can get away with it easier with digital. Because you only have ostensibly two intensity levels if you were doing a true digital broadcast, which means it's only going to create two spikes up and down the line. So you can easily just filter them between each other, so you get the main, the lower, and the upper sideband peaks. You could weave them in and out of each other and get a lot more channels that way, which ostensibly is what that means. That's not actually how digital transmissions are done. They really aren't. It's kind of like that. It's not really that clean, but you get the idea. You can pack more into the bandwidth. So what I was looking up is, are you allowed to use the now disabled TV broadcasts below a certain wattage? And again, the FCC says, we don't care if you transmit 0 watts. We're going to prosecute. You can't have analog TV broadcasts. They're very militant about it. But the Gemini device is still technically legal because they didn't put a time limit on it and have not posted that the Gemini Rabbit Multiplier is no longer licensed. It still carries a license. The license was paid for by the company for who knows how much money. And the original type that just used a twisted wire, or in this case, a straight wire, has no restriction on it at all because it technically isn't a transmitter. It's a radio frequency modulated signal fired through a wired connection. Wired connections aren't regulated by the FCC very much, or at all. This is a lot like running cable company cable or your VCR cable, the coax. But the thing is, the wire is less than 1/8 of an inch across by an 1/8 of an inch by a 1/16 of an inch. You could drill a 2 millimeter hole through a wall and run this through, and it would, if you could find this, or if you could reverse engineer it, you could send a TV signal or who knows data signals to another screen. Now this would be a use for really old TV sets because, again, as I mentioned, if you just take it from coax down to parallel pair through a ball-in, that's that little transformer thing you used when you were a kid on your TV set, and you just made it work for not 300 ohms like normal, but this stuff, you could get away with running cables from one room to another with what would look like a standard cable output for channel 3 or whatever, and do the same thing. It wouldn't involve any of this electronics. It would have a loss because this thing also provided a boost to the signal, so it could get it through the wires, but you could very easily wire a house with this stuff. And the easiest substitute would be to use telephone cable. So anyway, this is just what I found today because I was curious and I thought I'd pass it on. So that's the Rabbit Wireless VCR Multiplier and Videocaster by several companies. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. Bye.